Hi. Um, Hello, all York Historic Churches Trust people. I just wanted to re-record the lecture that I gave you guys back in December because I know my Wi-Fi was terrible that night and I know I dropped out a lot. So I offered this to Moira and hopefully will be useful for you guys to archive on your YouTube channel. So my lecture is going to focus on how a landscape approach to local churches, that is parish churches and parochial chapels and their earlier medieval antecedents, and the attendant material culture that goes with them, such as commemorative monuments and fonts, can provide new insights into the effects of the Norman Conquest on English society. These churches can tell us a lot about how people behaved within that period of transition and why and how and on what they chose to spend their money. Why certain kinds of material culture were seen as particularly valuable when people had to navigate a period of intense sociocultural and political change, and how the founding and building of parish churches profoundly changed the shape of the landscape in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. The vast majority of my examples are going to come from Northern England, primarily Yorkshire, which is obviously convenient for my audience, but this is actually for sound academic reasons too. First, Yorkshire's got excellent prevalence of certain types of parochial architecture and material culture that survive from the immediate pre- and post-conquest period. And secondly, because of the pre-conquest history of the region as part of the Danelaw and post-conquest upheavals like the Harrying of the North, it's a really interesting region of the country in which to explore how that longer process of the Norman Conquest played out and what archaeology can contribute to our understanding of it. And although I'm focusing on Northern England because that's where I've gathered detailed evidence, the importance of taking a regional approach is not just an argument I want to make for this corner of England. I'm on record in publications saying that I don't think there is anything such as the Norman Conquest. I think there are many Norman conquests which happened in different ways on differing timescales with different major players and with different outcomes, depending very much on the existing material and social contexts which the Normans encountered in different regions of England. So it's not that the Norman conquest of the North was really unusual and everywhere else had a normal conquest. The experience in London would have been different from that in East Anglia and different again from the West Midlands. So the point I want to make is that the kind of work that I've done in the North can be usefully done in other parts of the country. I think it's really essential to understand regional and local processes if we want to create more nuanced and detailed interpretations of national or international events, which are usually characterized at much broader and homogeneous scales. Because the Norman Conquest is established as such a defining event of English history, and because the Harrying of the North is, apart from the Battle of Hastings, the most famous thing that happened during the conquest, there is a tendency to think that we have a pretty good grasp on what happened during the Norman Conquest of the North. The late 11th and early 12th centuries in the region are often characterized in very stark oppositional terms of Normans versus natives. The Northerners are fractious and rebellious and don't want to be taxed or ruled by earls sent from down south. Then King William is reactionary and cruel and violent, and the Normans kill and burn indiscriminately in retaliation for the northern revolts, leaving the north and particularly Yorkshire a desolate wasteland. We mainly get this picture from historical chronicles of the 11th and 12th centuries, which are very lurid in their descriptions of the harrying. From these excerpts, you can see commentary on William spent the whole winter laying waste to the countryside, slaughtering the inhabitants and inflicting evil. And then because of this, throughout nearly the whole of England, northern England, a severe famine prevailed, chiefly in Northumbria. Men were driven to feed on the flesh of horses, dogs, cats, and even human beings. And this account from Simeon of Durham says it's horrific to see bodies rotting in the houses and on the roads, and everybody has died by sword or starvation, and says there was no village inhabited between York and Durham for 9 years afterwards. And then on top of that, those chronicles, we get information from Domesday Book, which seems to corroborate that story. There's a lot of waste entries in the Yorkshire Domesday, and there are sparse numbers of ploughs and people in Yorkshire in 1086 in comparison to the records from the South and Midlands. So it does all seem to indicate a fairly straightforward story of confrontation, aggression, and imposition of Norman rule by force. And then this narrative drives the popular TV history and education versions of the Norman Conquest as well. So Dan Snow tells you that all Yorkshiremen still hate William the Conqueror, and Key Stage 3 students get visuals that focus on Normans burning everything. Apart from castles, which can be easily worked into the Norman violence and imposition narrative, what we end up with is a story with very little nuance and one that's driven primarily by documentary evidence, where material culture and archaeology don't really get to play a role, and I think they should. Another problem of the fame of 1066, and this is everywhere, not just the North, is that the 11th to 12th centuries get reduced to the conquest. There's the temptation to try to join any archaeological evidence that we do collect from these centuries onto this major event, to explain that late 11th century things are the way they are simply because of the conquest. Job done. But the reality is obviously a lot more complex than that. The conquest was undoubtedly influential, but there are also fundamental and long-term transformations in the manorial landscape, in parochial structures, in building practices, and in commemorative practice taking place across the whole of English society that started before the conquest and continued past it. And it's also true that the trajectory of these transformations was in many cases impacted by the conquest and either accelerated or consciously taken advantage of by the Normans in the process of accomplishing their goals. So we need to try to get at that more nuanced story of what difference the conquest made in lots of different areas of society, not just assuming that it was either the primary cause or that it didn't matter at all. One of the best ways to both focus on material culture and also drill down to a more local level to try to understand these processes and the conquest role in them is by looking at parish churches. And this is for a couple reasons. First, they existed long before the conquest and long after it, but the 10th to 12th centuries were a really formative period in their development. Second, they're canvases for elite expenditure and expressions of social identity, which makes them a great kind of piece of evidence to look at for the people who are playing major roles in this process. Third, they're landmarks in the settlement and wider landscape, and they're imbued with a sense of permanence and importance that's due both to their spiritual significance, but also their physicality, the fact that they're constructed in stone. And for their community buildings. They're open to and relevant to all strata of society, and they're installed in settlements where Normans and natives are forced to interact with each other on a day-to-day level in order to get on with this process of making England an Anglo-Norman country. So what do we know already about churches in the Anglo-Norman landscape? First, we know from settlement studies that the location of the parish church is important, both before the conquest and afterwards. Here you can see the church and castle at Castle Bolton in North Yorkshire, and they're side by side. Both of these were in existence in the late 11th century, although most of the standing fabric that you can see here is now later medieval. And then also excavations from places like Raunds in Northamptonshire have shown us how a church and a manorial enclosure were created and developed together from the 10th century. So here you can see the aisled hall of the manorial enclosure, and here the church and the graveyard right next to it. Robin Daniels's work on churches and settlements in the Tees Valley of northern England has also demonstrated that the association of elite secular sites and local churches began well before the conquest. So this relationship already existed in a lot of cases, and in a lot of cases it's kept by the Normans, and new sites often had their manor and castle and church, or manor or castle and church built together. The alignment of church and manor sites is common throughout the country, but there are regional variations responding to local scenarios. For example, David Stocker and Paul Everson have identified a number of churches in Lincolnshire that were founded near manors, but they have also observed a substantial number of churches founded in the 10th and 11th century that were not associated with manors. These were instead placed on greens, which may have been due to the communal efforts of soakmen. These are free peasants, of which there were lots of them in Domesday Lincolnshire, many more than in other regions. And that these free men founding churches together as part of a kind of community effort on communal land, instead of manorial lords founding them on the domain land of the manor. Regardless, in both these cases, and the ones where there was a close relationship with the manor, we can clearly see that church foundation and location in the settlement was really important to prominent members of the community from a long period prior to the conquest. My own work on churches of the period, My own work on churches of the period has been focused less on the details of individual churches and settlements, but has instead concentrated on looking at larger patterns of churches in the landscape and how the wider physical, territorial, cultural, and material environments affected churches and were affected by them. So I've tried to combine landscape and material approaches, and this has meant recording specific features and dates and physical characteristics of the church fabric, and things like fonts and grave monuments, but also using spatial analysis at regional and sub-regional scales to look at patterns of patronage and expenditure over extended areas of time. And this approach takes into account not only the architectural fabric of the church, like this tower, but also fixtures like funerary monuments and fonts, which were an integral part of the spiritual and material life of the church. For those of you who aren't super familiar with the period, before I get into detail of what's specifically happening in Yorkshire, I want to start by giving some large-scale background into important early medieval developments in both the manorial and parochial landscapes, which were always closely tied to each other due to the importance of ecclesiastical patronage to both major and minor lords in both the pre- and post-conquest periods. So this general trajectory, which has been laid out in detail by people like John Blair and others, argues for the establishment of minsters, or mother churches, and their subsidiary churches in the 7th to 9th centuries. And these are often closely related to royal estates and to other major landholding territories. Then, beginning in the 10th century, both of these systems begin to break up. The secular estates and the large proto-parish territories start breaking up into smaller entities, which begin to resemble the manors and parishes we know from the later Middle Ages. Alongside these structural changes, we start to see an increase in the foundation of new manorially sited local churches, and this flourishes in the 10th and 11th centuries. They exist alongside many of the minsters, which continue in use, and eventually end up challenging those mother churches for rights of pastoral care and patronage and tithes and congregations. There's a lot of local and regional variation, but on the whole, this hodgepodge of minsters and local churches become the seeds of the later medieval parochial system. But it's really the 11th and 12th centuries where the system comes into being, where the various churches begin to shake out into something more like an organized hierarchy. And this ostensibly has legally defined rules and restrictions, such as which churches are subsidiary and to whom, and who gets to bury and who doesn't, and which churches owe dues and where they owe them. And it appears that the steady increase in the number of local churches, which had been ongoing since the 10th century, slows down by the end of the 12th century, when the formalization of canon law plays an important role in limiting new church foundations. And they start to tighten up on who can found a church and when a new church can be established. But this is also a period of the documentation of disputes between parish churches and chapels, these subsidiary churches, over their rights and status. And complicated hierarchical networks and pastoral arrangements were really common in this formative period, demonstrating that even once the map of parishes is formed, it's not really settled at this point. At the same time as these systemic changes to the local church were happening, there were also substantial physical changes. The pre-existing stone minster churches of the 8th and 9th centuries were often rebuilt or added to during this time. And excavations of some parish churches, like at Warren Percy, which you can see here on the left, and at Raunds on the right, have shown that churches which started life as wooden or small stone churches in the 10th century were steadily rebuilt, often many times over, in stone in the 11th and 12th centuries, as part of a process which Richard Gem has referred to as the Great Rebuilding of churches. And this happens in both big churches and also minor churches like parishes. At the same time as all this is going on in parochial structure and church architecture, the Anglo-Saxon ecclesiastical tradition of erecting stone sculpture at local churches also starts to be adopted and adapted by new patrons. We see a change from large, elaborate shrine markers and churchyard crosses of the sort. You can see this is the crosshead from Lastingham, this one from the West Riding, where these big churchyard crosses from the 8th and 9th centuries change into smaller forms of standing and recumbent stone sculpture, which become common from the 10th century. And they continue in use through the conquest into the later Middle Ages. They vary widely in iconography and are primarily commissioned to commemorate the burial of priests and lay individuals at local churches. So here you can see an example of a standing cross from the Anglo-Scandinavian period and a recumbent monument with a cross and interlace, also from the late 10th century. And then you see here cross-slab grave monuments. Some of these showing elements of, most of these are post-conquest in date, but they show elements of transition from these pre-existing pre-conquest forms. So instead of interlace on this one, you have a cross and chevron. Here you have the persistence of interlace into a post-medieval monument. And then up here you can see an example of a kind of fully formed 12th century cross-slab. So it's important to note that this doesn't happen in the same way in all areas of the country. The North is particularly rich in both Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Scandinavian sculpture, as well as in post-conquest cross-slab grave markers. And it's one of the reasons I like working in this region. They provide an important additional layer of material evidence for understanding local church formation and patronage that you don't necessarily get in other parts of the country. So now that we've got an understanding of the trajectory of 10th to 12th century parish church development in general terms, I want to start showing you what that changing parochial landscape looked like on the ground in Yorkshire. These maps of parish church development were created by collating evidence from architecture, from commemorative sculpture, from fonts, from Domesday Book, and other forms of documentary evidence. And I've done this for the North Riding of Yorkshire, which you can see mapped out on my slide here, but it's an exercise that could be carried out anywhere where you've got Domesday Book and a decent tranche of surviving ecclesiastical architecture and sculpture. So in the North Riding of Yorkshire, we know of at least 254 parish churches and parochial chapels that were in existence in the later Middle Ages. Probably once there were even more than that, but we'll have lost some of the chapels particularly. In the Anglian period of the 7th to 9th centuries, which is represented on this slide, there's evidence for 38 or 15% of those churches existing at that early date. But if we move to the end of the 10th century, there were 81 churches. About a third of the late medieval total. And this evidence comes from sites where we find Anglo-Scandinavian sculpture, primarily. There's no definitive surviving architectural evidence from the 10th century in Yorkshire. That does exist in other parts of the country, but not here. And then by 1100, so another century on, we have 125 churches, or about half. That have at least one form of documentary or material evidence which attests to their existence at that time. The prevalence of 9th and 10th century sculpture indicates that most of these churches that are existing up to circa 1100 are pre-conquest foundations, although there are undoubtedly some churches in this number that were founded and built in the immediate aftermath of the Norman Conquest. Unfortunately, neither Domesday Book records nor architectural fabric from the period are sufficiently diagnostic to assign a really firm pre- or post-conquest foundation date to some of these. But we can see that the basic skeleton of the medieval parochial structure was very much formed by circa 1100, when at least 60% of the region's eventual parish churches were in existence and likely in active use. Then a century later, around 1200, it looks likely that this parochial map has reached its full late medieval form. 82% of all the churches in the Riding have evidence for their existence from about 1200. And almost all of that gap, almost all of what we're missing, that 20%, is in chapelries, many which would have been later medieval foundations, responding to population growth and colonization of marginal land and things like that. At least 90% of the Riding's parish churches have material or documentary evidence for their existence by 1200. And probably that should be 100%. What we're probably seeing, that missing 10%, is the likelihood that there was some complete overwriting of some early evidence by later medieval building programs. So we also have at this point over 50%, 58% of the Riding's parochial chapels being in existence. So this formal framework of pastoral care is starting to fill in around the most densely populated settlements. So by 1200, only 17 of these many black dots that you see here are solely based on documentary evidence. The rest are marked by the presence of architecture, fonts, or commemorative monuments, and sometimes all three of them, which demonstrates the intensity of investment and how highly local church patronage was valued in this period. Before getting onto some detailed case studies, I want to dial back to the map of churches of circa 1100, which gives us our best idea of what was going on right around the period of the Norman Conquest. The most significant aspect of this map is not particular distributions, because you can see there's pretty good coverage across the whole of the county, or the riding, but rather that the material evidence for churches in North Yorkshire in the 11th and early 12th centuries seems to contrast pretty sharply with those general indicators of poverty that we see in the Domesday Book statistics and the devastation that's described in the Chronicles. It appears that much of the North Riding of Yorkshire is engaged in church patronage not long after the conquest, with the only obvious gaps being the high moors over here and the dales over here, which is not unexpected, given that many settlements on marginal land weren't established until the later Middle Ages. So while Yorkshire might have been impoverished in comparison to some regions of the country, the evidence from parish churches demonstrates that it's far from a wasteland in the post-harrying decades, and that patrons had expendable wealth, which they were choosing to deploy in parish churches. And this is the first example of the kind of nuance that looking at churches can add to that traditional narrative of the Norman Conquest of the North. So now that we have this overview of churches and landscape in Yorkshire, I now want to drill down to a couple of case studies, which will illuminate the particulars of these processes of manorialization and parochialization that I've discussed so far, and allow us to get a glimpse into how churches shaped the landscape in that peri-conquest period. So the two examples I'm going to give now probe the patronage distributions above in further detail in two parts of the county, exploring how the changing political and economic climate in the late 11th century might have affected churches and their development. And they demonstrate how significantly different patterns might occur, even within a reasonably small geographic area. So the two regions that I'm looking at, the first, this kind of red circle, is 22 parishes near Northallerton in the Northern Vale of York. And this blue circle I'm going to talk about second is churches in what's called the Honour of Richmond in the western part of the county. So in this area of the Northern Vale of York, you can see how the evidence for churches in the area progresses over time. By the 10th century, we have a region that's well served by early churches. You can see in these red dots here. A lot of the parishes in the region have churches. But despite the evidence for pre-conquest church patronage, it seems that there isn't much happening in the area's churches in the late 11th century. Only 3 places here seem to have active patronage going on. Domesday Book mentions a church at Ainderby Steeple in 1086, but there's no evidence of Saxon-Norman sculpture in the area. And there's only 2 instances of architecture that could date to circa 1100. First, there's a tympanum from Danby Wisk, which is definitely post-conquest, but probably quite early post-conquest, and some long and short work at Sockburn, in the coins at Sockburn. And this is possibly either pre-conquest or immediately post-conquest. And this is unusual. Generally, if there's a good amount of pre-conquest investment, we do see that trend tend to continue through the conquest into the post-conquest period. When we compare the provision of churches with the circumstances of tenure and population in the region around 1086, around the time of Domesday Book, there are some possible explanations for the lack of investment. The Northern Vale of York had obviously been an important region for settlement and church foundation and elite commemoration in the 10th century, and that's probably also when it acquired its parochial and manorial structure. But records in Domesday Book show that it may have lost a lot of its manorial wealth by the late 11th century. Many of the settlements in these parishes were recorded as wholly waste in 1086. There's no value or population recorded. And in many cases, the value of the individual manors had dropped from 20 or 40 shillings to 0 between 1066 and 1086. And if we look at the manor of Northallerton, which is the most extensive estate in this area, which had belonged to the Earls of Northumbria, and many of these parishes belong to that estate, the drop in value is really staggering. It went from £80 in 1066 to no value and wholly waste in 1086. So the material evidence from the 10th century suggests there were likely to be churches already in existence in many of these settlements, but they may not have been recorded in Domesday Book because the manors themselves had no monetary taxable value in 1086. Similarly, a lot of the other churches in the area may have lacked investment in the 11th century because the population on many of the sites was negligible and agricultural exploitation in the area was at a low point. In this situation, the disposable resources needed to contribute to church rebuilding would be scarce, and as most of the land was held directly by the king and not tenanted, there weren't many potential patrons on the ground in the area. So it's possible that nobody present in this little region saw the immediate need for or the social benefit of spending money on churches in an economically depressed area. It's almost certainly no coincidence that 2 of the 3 manors in the Northern Vale of York, which both had value in 1086 and a subtenant in place, and that's Ainderby Steeple and Danby Wisk, also had a church mentioned in Domesday or material evidence for the late 11th century. Sockburn, which is down here in green, is not recorded in Domesday Book because it's partially in County Durham, and Durham doesn't get a record in Domesday Book. But it was known to be property of the Bishop of Durham before and after the conquest. And we know that Roger de Conyers was subtenanted there by at least 1100. So in these locations, in contrast to the other manors in the area that were held by the king and were not subtenanted, there may have been someone of elite status on the ground who would have had a compelling interest in revitalizing that manor and its church. So whatever decline there was in the late 11th century in the Northern Vale of York, it doesn't seem to have lasted very long. We know from architecture and commemoration and fonts that the churches there were being heavily invested in by the mid-12th century, and patronage was being carried out there at a similar rate to the rest of the North Riding. Not long after the Domesday Survey, William Rufus grants the entire estate of Northallerton to the Bishop of Durham, and Robert de Bruce is granted a number of manors in the decade after 1100. So what we're likely seeing is a change of fortunes in the area that's tied to the steady progress of subinfeudation in the manors, and the creation of a situation that drove manorial investment, and probably because of competitive display amongst these minor landholders. A contrast to the situation in the Northern Vale of York can be seen in the western part of the riding in a region known as the Honour of Richmond. Here we have significant numbers of late 11th and early 12th century churches and commemorative monuments, which seems to tell quite a different story of the early post-conquest period. Traditionally, the argument for this part of the country is that it's hard for the Normans to bring these more western, remote parts of Yorkshire under control, and that the harrying would have been particularly severe in the area. And that's been inferred from lots and lots of Domesday waste in 1086. In order to better control these regions, William grants large, compact lordships in which all the holdings that the lord had were contiguous, rather than spread out across the county or across the country, as they were in some cases. And so there's a couple examples of these in Yorkshire. This is the Honour of Richmond in the North Riding, that's held by Count Allen of Brittany, and there's also Pickhill and Pontefract in the West Riding. But the amount of investment in churches in the Honour of Richmond during the late 11th and early 12th centuries seems to contradict the narratives about particularly severe harrying or an area that's massively depressed or wild or hard to control. Paul Dalton has argued that one of the consequences of gaining control over the region was that the Normans were forced to let many of Yorkshire's minor pre-conquest landholders keep their lands, although they did push them down the tenurial hierarchy when they did that. So we know that in 1069, William greets in a friendly fashion all my thanes in Yorkshire, both English and French. So that's some evidence that we have both English and Norman landholders kind of on an equal footing with each other at subtenant level. And we also have some evidence from Domesday Book, where Yorkshire features a higher number of native subtenants than many other counties. So here we have a few such as Gospatrick and Bjornulfer, which are indications that you have some people continuing, and Uhtred up here, which are you have some people continuing to hold, native men continuing to hold on the other side of the conquest. Some of these guys are landholders who kept the land that they held prior to the conquest. But there were also a number of native lords in Doomsday who held land after the conquest that they had not held in 1066. So these were not merely landholders who were hanging on through the conquest, but natives who may have been deliberately aligning themselves with the new regime and benefiting from the process of conquest by acquiring new land. And this may suggest that the honor of Richmond's local churches of the late 11th and early 12th centuries were not all tied to the post-conquest investments of Norman local lords. Some could have very well been founded and built by Anglo-Scandinavian subtenants, who would have held similar tenurial status with the Norman knights. But even if the lords carrying out the building or commemorating in these churches were ethnically native, their churches and manorial developments were helping to build that new Norman hierarchical framework. For native subtenants, patronizing churches may have been a way of showing their Norman overlords and their peers that they belonged in this new social structure. So in both the Northern Vale of York and the Honour of Richmond, the extent of subtenantry seems to have been really key to what happens to parish churches. Local church evidence demonstrates that the installation of minor elite lordship at manorial level, not just at kind of high royal level or baronial level, and the motivations of these local landholders had more to do with 11th century economic prosperity and investment in material culture than either simple geography or the impacts of the harrying of the North. Even in an area like the Honour of Richmond, where many of the manors were recorded as waste in 1086, the presence of interested patrons in those decades up to 1100 who had both the economic means and direct control over the day-to-day life of the estate was more impactful on church patronage than either poor arable land, lasting damage from the conquest, or concerns about holding on to native or Norman ethnic identities or allegiances. My next detailed example will step away from the years immediately around the conquest and look at slightly later, longer-term Anglo-Norman developments in churches, which took place over the whole of the 12th century, and how patrons were specifically using stone architecture and material culture to attempt to control a parochial landscape that was still very much in flux in this period. The first notable source of evidence from this period is architecture. So here we have all the churches up to circa 1200 with evidence, and here all the ones in blue, so that's 76% of those churches have surviving evidence for investment in stone architecture by 1200, compared to around 25% in the 11th century. So we can really see here, this is the great rebuilding in full swing. There are also 253 grave monuments dating from circa 1000 to 1200 at 82 different church sites across the riding. The vast majority of these monuments date to the 12th century rather than to the 11th. So here the green squares have monuments and the gray squares are churches in existence by 1200 that don't have monuments. So you can see they're evenly distributed across the whole of the region. That demonstrates that not only burial rites are clearly devolved to the local churches from the minsters by this time, but also that a substantial and steadily increasing number of patrons were choosing to spend their money on stone commemorative monuments. Stone fonts in Romanesque styles, which again date primarily to the 12th century, were also widely distributed, surviving at 74 sites across the riding. So red dots have fonts and gray ones don't. Sometimes they're in churches with surviving Norman or earlier architectural fabric, and sometimes they're in churches that are now wholly late or post-medieval. But the presence of a Romanesque font definitely indicates that there would have been a contemporary 12th century church to go with it, even if subsequent rebuilding has now overwritten that contemporary building. The sheer amount of 12th century architecture and material culture that survives even in the face of a further 3 centuries of medieval alterations and intensive Victorian restorations speaks to how significant the 12th century was in terms of local church patronage by both secular and ecclesiastical elites. And this is a development that frequently gets attributed to the Norman Conquest. William of Malmesbury observes in his chronicle that every day more churches arose in a new manner of building. But we know from the maps I've shown tonight that the patterns of church patronage that we see in the 12th century are simply an acceleration of what had been a well-established key part of elite behavior much earlier than 1066. And the focus was not restricted to just those few decades following the conquest, as the narrative of Norman imposition might lead us to expect. The mid and late 12th centuries, when the conquest is 100 years in the rearview mirror, are actually far more intense periods of investment. Indeed, apart from 15th century refenestration programs, changing of windows, there's really no more comprehensive century of expenditure in parish churches. So it's important to note that this wealth of material evidence dating from 1100 to 1200 is not just an indicator that the 12th century is a source of a mountain of evidence. It's also the source of a mountain of evidence that survives now. And that's meaningful, not accidental, because there were 4 more centuries of medieval church building, rebuilding, and renovation yet to come. So it seems that parish communities and patrons were in many cases making deliberate choices to retain many of these 12th century features throughout the later Middle Ages, perhaps as a way of signaling their church's antiquity by curating its earliest stone. And this is something I'm going to get into a bit more detail next, looking particularly at the development of dependent parochial chapels. So parochial chapels are often the forgotten entity of the medieval parochial structure. These churches are technically subordinate to a mother church. They owe dues and tithes, and they're supposed to be unable to carry out the major sacraments of baptism and burial and marriage, which are all supposed to be performed at the parish church. But the status of a church or chapel was often unclear even into the 12th and 13th centuries, and the relationships were complicated because the locations and status of chapels seem to have been closely tied to patterns of manorial dependencies as well. So they're not just religious relationships, there are tenurial relationships here too. And it can be hard to draw distinctions because these nominally dependent chapels between these nominally dependent chapels and officially recognized parish churches, and their status could change over time, often due to the lobbying of the landholders who wanted their church to rise in status. So the North Riding evidence demonstrates that 35 churches, which were designated as chapels in the late Middle Ages, were in existence from the 11th or 12th centuries or even before. And in addition, perhaps due to their ancient foundations, some of these chapels seem to have acquired rites of baptism and burial early on in their existence, even though they were officially subordinate to a parish church. The acquisition of burial and baptismal rites sometimes resulted in independence and eventually official parochial status, but some chapels remained technically subsidiary to a parish church even when they held sacramental rites. And some examples from the parish and manor of Pickering illustrate this complexity really well. So Pickering has dependent chapels at Allerston, Eberston, Ellerburn, and all of these become independent parish churches in the middle of the 13th century. But we know that Eberston and Ellerburn both already had fonts, so presumably were baptizing from at least a century before their technical independence. Eberston also has 5 cross slabs, which are datable to before 1200. And there were funerary markers at Ellerburn as early as the 10th century, as we can see from this Anglo-Scandinavian cross. Gilling West is another example of this sort of complexity. There were 6 chapels to the mother church on outlying lands of that manor, and you can see them marked here in blue. Like at Pickering, many of these chapels were of early foundation and probably were not as dependent as their label of chapel implies. Sculpture shows that Forset and Airyholm were in existence and burying by the 10th century. 3 of the churches have 12th century fonts, and 2 have evidence of 11th and 12th century stone commemoration. So these ostensibly dependent chapels had acquired the parochial rites of baptism and burial at a very early stage in their existence. They may have been linked and technically subordinate to Gilling, probably because of long-standing manorial associations. But the patrons and communities of these churches were using fonts and grave monuments to materially declare their independence from the parish church of Gilling from an early date. These chapels are dependent in the documentary record, but this label understates their prominence as early centers of material patronage, pastoral care, and community importance. The key is that their significance had been established before the codification of the parochial system in canon law. So regardless of their technically subsidiary status, it became really hard to reverse those rights once they were recognized to be of antiquity. The provision of stone fonts and burial monuments in the North Riding's chapels in the 11th and 12th centuries can thus tell us not only a lot about when and how chapels came into being, but also how patrons and parish communities utilized material culture to lay claim to rights, status, and historical legacies. So in the North Riding, 54 surviving early stone fonts are found at parish churches, and 20 of them are located at chapels. So where you can see red squares, we have fonts at chapels. This means that about a third of parish churches in existence by 1200 retain a surviving 12th century font, while over half of pre-1200 chapels do. So retaining your 12th century font is a popular thing for a church to do, but it's clear that there was a significantly stronger tendency for chapels to retain their original font throughout the later Middle Ages compared to parish churches, possibly because of the font's role as a powerful material symbol of the longevity of the church's pastoral rites. Parish churches were more often have 12th century fonts than ones of any other medieval date. So the antiquity of the rite is clearly of value to them. But then they were nevertheless often replaced by a new and more stylistically up-to-date font at some point in the later Middle Ages. But if we contrast chapels to parish churches, none of the pre-1200 chapels in the North Riding without a 12th century font have a later medieval one. So if those chapels currently have a font, it's always post-medieval. This indicates that either those chapels never achieved baptismal rites until after the Middle Ages. They commonly did this in the 19th century, in the Victorian period. Or if they did, it was likely their original font that the 19th century one replaced. And this pattern demonstrates that the antiquity of the font was particularly important to chapels, given that their historic sacramental rites may well have come under threat from either the parish church or the bishop or a new lord of their mother church's manor. They needed to be able to draw on the material evidence of their ancient stone font in order to defend not only the existence of their right to baptize, but also the centuries over which they had held that right. And it's less important for parish churches to do this because nobody's questioning whether parish churches have the right to baptize. For burial rites, far fewer early chapels had burial rites than baptismal ones. Compared to 58 parish churches containing funerary sculpture from the 10th century, only 9 chapels currently possess commemorative evidence from that period. It also appears that the number of chapels with burial rites didn't increase as we move into the 11th and 12th centuries. Only 7 chapels feature pre-1200 funerary monuments. This suggests that during the codification of the parochial system, burial rites are guarded more jealously than baptismal ones by parish churches. And that's probably because there's a fee attached to them. There's the soul scot fee that you pay when you bury, whereas baptism is technically free. What we do see, however, is a high degree of continuity of burial rites from the 10th century through to the 12th. So 6 of the 9 chapels that have 10th century funerary sculpture also feature burial monuments of the 11th and 12th centuries. The 3 that don't are Haxby, Ellerburn, and Castle Bolton. But we do know that Haxby successfully petitions for burial rites in the 14th century. In 1328, they lose the body of one of their congregation to the River Foss while attempting to carry him to Strensel for burial. And they complain about this, that they should have burial rites because they're losing guys in the river. And Ellerburn also has a fragment of a likely later medieval cross slab, perhaps from its transition to full parochial status in the 13th century. So when it moves into getting official parochial status, it starts to bury. So it looks like it was unusual for chapels that had gained early burial rites to lose them in the later Middle Ages, especially if they had surviving material evidence to demonstrate their antiquity. Equally, if a chapel did have burial rites in the 12th century, they had almost always held that right for at least 2 centuries already. So although losing a body to the river was likely a pretty convincing petition for giving Haxby the right to bury, undoubtedly the surviving sculptural evidence the burials had taken place at Haxby from its foundation supported that claim even further. Unlike grave monuments, which to an extent could accrete over time without disturbing earlier examples, the preservation of an original font requires particularly deliberate choices by patrons and the parish community, as there could only be one font at a time. So the patterns of preservation suggest that the antiquity of the font was particularly important to chapels, given that their pastoral rites may well have come under threat. And we do see deliberate preservation of old burial monuments too, such as these 10th century monuments displayed prominently in the 11th century architectural fabric at Kirkdale and in the 12th century fabric at Sennington. So these are Anglo-Scandinavian crosses in the 11th century fabric at Kirkdale, and here is a little crosshead, a 10th century crosshead in 12th century fabric at Sennington. Parishioners, priests, and patrons might have needed to draw on the material evidence of their stone font or grave monuments if someone questioned the legitimacy of their status. They could then not only defend the existence of their right to baptize or bury, but also the longevity of that right. And these objects could be actively deployed by patrons who desired to shape that still fluid parochial landscape, to try to force their church, and thus themselves, into more prestigious social positions. So I hope these detailed case studies, as well as the overview of patronage and the developing parochial landscape in North Yorkshire, illustrate the value of exploring parish churches and their material culture on a variety of scales, from the individual church through to local groupings and up to wider regional patterns. They give us insight into a group of patrons and audiences who rarely appear in the historical documents, and who thus don't get the credit they deserve for being the driving forces on the ground, making much bigger processes like manorialization and parochialization and the Norman Conquest itself happen. Another theme that I hope emerges from this is that of the essential role played by ecclesiastical material culture, whether that be in the form of architecture or fonts or grave monuments, in enabling people to deal with a major social change like the conquest. Investment in the fabric and fittings of the church allowed patrons to reify rights that would have otherwise been intangible, or identities and histories and legacies, and to show that they belong to particular status groups and enable them to stake their claim to a social position. And lastly, I hope that this talk has added some nuance and variation to the story of the 11th and 12th centuries in Northern England, making it about more than just conquest and conflict and harrying and waste, and instead giving you some insight into some of the myriad other ways in which an Anglo-Scandinavian world became an Anglo-Norman one. All right, thank you very much.